Good morning. Good morning. Weren't you surprised by the snow this morning? Our presenter is Dr. David Petering, a UWM Distinguished Professor of Chemistry and Biochemistry. He's an internationally recognized scientist of several areas of metals, biological systems. Last week, we took up the rise in global average temperature for our Earth, the rise of energy consumption, the rise in greenhouse gases especially, and we were surprised by methane. And today, Dr. Petering is going to take up what are the potential effects and what are some things we could do about climate change. Could you welcome him again this morning?
There it goes. How's this? Okay.
We can hear it now.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it. All right. Okay, good to be with you again. There are handouts for the slides that I'm going to be using today. I'm just going to review just very briefly what we talked about last time. So remember, here's the issue that global average surface temperature has been going up inexorably, and actually it seems like it's starting to even go at a faster rate since about the 1960s. And what we talked about last time was that this is being driven by an increase in the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere that is basically increasing because of our increasing use of fossil fuels to drive our economy and drive the global economy. And so carbon dioxide concentration completely follows temperature, or temperature follows carbon dioxide concentration, if you will. Now, the very important thing that sometimes people aren't aware of about this is that not only is there carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, but there's another very important greenhouse gas, methane, a third one which we did not talk about, which is also important, although not quite at the same scale, if you will, nitrous oxide. But with respect to carbon dioxide, the big thing is that for any amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if we were to magically stop putting any more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that concentration would remain for centuries before you would see much of a decrease, because the turnover of carbon dioxide is very slow on a geological timescale almost. Okay, so we're on a one-way track, if you will. What we've done can't be changed. The weather is not going to get any better, if you will. The climate is not going to become more stable again. But the point is that the more carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, the increasing damage we're doing to our planet and its capacity to serve as a home for living things. So, so as a consequence, this international panel called the United Nations International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change puts out suggestions about what's going to happen on the basis of the way we do our future. Are we actually going to address this problem and get to net zero, get to net zero carbon emissions and limit our total warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That was the goal. Problem is we're already at 1.5 degrees Celsius. All right, so I mean, this is a really serious problem, and this particular slide was meant to show that as the temperature, average temperature goes up, so of course does the damage to the environment. Okay, and at 1.5 degrees, we're still in this sort of moderate damage situation, but as we go higher in temperature, we're going to get into this area, which is calamitous, really, for our planet. So that's the issue, if you will. Now, I wanted to spend a little more time on more discrete issues with respect to the climate, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. This really is a global issue that's taking place. I'm going to focus on, I call it the cryosphere. We're talking about the parts of the planet that are basically ice covered and so forth. And we're going to start out talking about the Arctic. And I chose this basically because the Arctic has been warming about 4 times as fast as the rest of the planet. Okay, so what's happening here is that we're looking at 2 scenarios, if you will, 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2.7. Basically, the ice, which normally covers the Arctic Ocean, if you will, has been receding, so the amount of summer ice is smaller, and if we go to 2.7 degrees Celsius, there won't be any summer ice. Well, does that have consequences? It surely does. One of them has to do with the loss of, in the terrestrial part of the Arctic, the permafrost. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the other one I want to talk about is something that's in the news a lot, but not for this reason, and that's Greenland. Okay, so Greenland is covered with ice, and that ice is going to be melting. All right, so that's where we're headed. And if you take a look at what's happened since, say, 1980 to 2020, the amount of ice that is covering the Arctic Ocean is just continuing to decline, if you will. And you can see that down here, a comparison from a sort of a satellite picture of this. And the reason for this basically is that as the sun is coming in, normally if you've got ice, that sunlight is simply reflected. But to the extent that you've got open water, that sunlight is absorbed and is converted into heat. So you have kind of this self-reinforcing cycle that's going on that you can see here. So you are seeing that the amount of ice cover on the ocean is declining, meaning the amount of open ocean is increasing. More heat is being absorbed. You can see that here in the ocean temperature. The ocean temperature is going up. The oceans are a great reservoir for heat, but of course they're in contact with the atmosphere, so they're contributing heat back into the atmosphere. Heat in the atmosphere is itself then contributing to the decline of ice on the Arctic, if you will. So you've got this self-reinforcing cycle that's taking place, and the results of this are, number one, that the so-called permafrost is starting to melt. Okay, so this area up in the Arctic that we see around the Arctic Ocean, if you will, has been permanently frozen, if you will. And the interesting thing about this is that as living things die and so forth, normally they're in this cycle of growth, and then when they die, decay, and you have this cycling of the carbon and so forth. But instead, in the Arctic, the carbon has just been building up, and it's pretty remarkable. About 30% of all of the terrestrial carbon in the soil, if you will, is located in the Arctic. But that's been sort of off limits for this cycle that we talked about last time. And instead it's just been lying there dormant. But as soon as this starts to melt, then microorganisms have access to it and start the decay process. The decay process basically leads to CO2, it leads to methane. Both of those then are going to be liberated in actually very large quantities. And in a recent paper that's, I think, down here, they estimate that if we don't actually seriously take action to limit the amount of warming, and this permafrost melting continues, that the amount of CO2 and methane that goes into the atmosphere is going to raise the temperature to the extent that China's contribution to atmospheric carbon dioxide will do over the next century. And since, in terms of what's happening now, China is adding more to the atmosphere than any other nation on the planet, that's a huge contributor. So melting of the permafrost is a very serious issue. Okay, now, the second thing I wanted to talk about here was Greenland, okay? We've heard a lot about Greenland, but not exactly in this context, if you will. And Greenland is larger than Alaska, if you will, showing the two there. And here's the thing that just is kind of mind-blowing in terms of a number. The amount of ice on Greenland, the amount of frozen water, is 570,000 cubic miles. Okay, that's an area of 570 miles by 1,000 miles by 1 mile. And it's almost, it's almost beyond comprehension, except that, of course, the Antarctic has a lot more than that. But nevertheless, what's happening, again, because of what we've been talking about, is that over the last 20 years and so, showing here, I actually figured this out. That's 10 quadrillion, okay, pounds of ice have melted. Okay, the consequence of this is already this has contributed almost an inch to average sea level, if you will, around the globe. Okay, you say, well, that's not very much. Actually, it is. So places along coasts are already feeling this. If you're in Florida and you're in Miami, you have chronic flooding that takes place because of this sea level rise that's going on. If this continues up to 2100, then we could have 11 inches of sea level rise just from what's happening in Greenland. I mean, it's enormous, if you will. That would be catastrophic for cities along coasts. And when you think about it, I don't know if I could say most of the cities, but a large number of cities are located on ocean coasts. Okay? All right, now there's something else about the melting in Greenland that actually has at least as serious a consequence, maybe even more. And this relates to something that people talk about all the time with respect to what's going on is, will there be tipping points? That is, places where upon a little bit more warming, we shift over into actually quite a different climate. Okay, and this is where it was mentioned, I think, the last time in our discussion. I have to show you this. I came upon this great slide of ocean currents. Do we ever think about these things? But ocean currents really are incredibly important for determining climate, if you will. So the warm surface water is shown here. The colder water, which is below the surface, is shown in blue, if you will. And I want to focus on this area down here because it's something we're quite familiar with when we think about the Gulf Stream current, if you will, which is this current moving up in this direction. So if we focus in here, what happens with the warm surface water, Gulf Stream water, as it heads north into this colder area is it gives up heat. And in the process becomes more dense, going from warm to cold. And once it gets up in this region, it's cold enough that it drops, if you will, it sinks within the ocean. and starts a return journey now as colder water down in these interconnected pathways, if you will, and the warm current will be regenerated, bringing heat from this area of the planet up to the north, if you will. What's so important about that? Without the Gulf Stream, Europe would be about 20 degrees Fahrenheit colder. It would be so cold that it could not really feed itself, if you will. Agriculture would not be much of a success at all. So this is a real question. Now, what's happening is that because of all of this melting of fresh water, the warm water, which is becoming more dense as it leaves off of its heat and so on, is being diluted. So it's not becoming more dense. And already there's evidence that this pathway that I'm showing to you here is slowing. If it comes to a halt, that's when we have this problem with Europe not being able to get the heat that it needs from the Gulf Stream in order to be successful. Do we ever think of that? Does Europe ever think about it? They probably are, actually, because they're a little bit further ahead than we are. The other thing that would happen, though, if this whole thing stopped is the areas where the Gulf Stream is gaining its heat from, which is down in the midsection of the planet, would become even hotter. So, I mean, this is all interconnected, if you will. This is a planetary system that we are in the process of disconnecting. Okay, now, I wanted to just go to something else that now relates to this whole issue of the melting of ice. So the Tibetan, this is a long way from where we were, but the Tibetan plateau showing up in this region is sometimes called the third pole. It has an enormous amount of ice, glacial ice, that's present there. Now that glacial ice actually is the source of water that provides for all of these major Asian rivers. Now, what do those rivers do? Well, they not only go to the ocean, okay, they're supplying fresh water for a huge Asian population. Okay, and there's a lot of concern that even by the time we get to 2050, a lot of those glaciers will have melted, and there will be a shortage of water for all of these countries that we're talking about that go all the way from China and India all the way to these that we see down here, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, okay? Enormous issue. Now you start thinking about this. Glaciers, they supply water. Is that really important? Sure. The Alps supply a lot of the fresh water for Europe. So what happens to the Rhine and the Danube rivers without the glacial ice from the Alps? Same issue as in Asia. What about the Amazon basin and the Andes glaciers? Again, the same issue. Well, we might as well include it. Rocky Mountains supply the water for the Colorado River. Colorado River is chronically short of what everybody thinks they need for water in the western United States. So this is just an enormous problem that we're talking about here. So just to kind of conclude this in terms of what's going on here, I have a quote that it just comes back to me over and over again, so I'm going to share it with you. And this is from a book by Loren Eiseley. Some of you may know him as just a wonderful nature writer. In a book called The Firmament of Time, and it's in the last chapter called How Natural is Natural. It is with the coming of modern man that a vast hole seems to open in nature. A vast black whirlpool spinning faster and faster, consuming flesh, stone, soil, minerals, sucking down the lightning, wrenching power from the atom, until the ancient sounds of nature are drowned in the cacophony of something which is no longer nature. Something instead which is loose and knocking at the world's heart, something demonic, and no longer planned, escaped it may be, spewed out of nature, contending in a final giant's game against its master. I don't know, that speaks to me about the gravity of the situation that we actually are in. So let's move on from this and ask the question, what needs to be done? And the answer is pretty quickly, bring ourselves to net zero carbon emissions. And there are really two aspects to this that we're going to be talking about. One is that the energy supply has to be net zero. But, of course, that energy supply is only useful if the end users can use it in a net zero sense. So there are both of those aspects, and sometimes we really are focusing on the first part of this and not thinking about the second part. So one of the sort of heroes of the environmental movement, you may not have heard his name, but he's a very important person in thinking from this from a historical standpoint, James Gustav Speth. He wrote in a book called Red Sky at Morning in 2004. For more than 2 decades, even non-geniuses like myself have known not only the gravity of the climate challenge, but more or less what we need to do about it. Now, Speth, when he talks about 2 decades before, he was the head of the Council of Economic Quality, I think it's called, in the Carter administration. And he was responsible for writing, or leading the writing, of a document which is really quite remarkable. It's a report that President Carter said we should make so that people can look forward to what the issues are going to be in the year 2000, Global 2000, entering the 21st century. Well, the reason he said more or less we knew about the gravity of this is really quite a stark graph over here that I just want to share with you. The first formal report on climate change was issued by the National Academy of Sciences in 1979. It's called the Charney Report. And in a way, it was almost a back of the envelope type of thing because people hadn't gathered all the sorts of information we have available now to think about the problem. But they said at that time, if we double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we'll raise that temperature 3 degrees Celsius, okay? That's over 5 degrees centigrade, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? Now, over time, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has continued to make these calculations on the best information, and this bar just represents kind of the uncertainty. It can't be positive. It's going to be 3, it might be higher, it might be lower. Finally, in 2020, they came to a more definitive conclusion. They decided it was going to be a little higher, actually. But the point is, actually, that average has not changed. People knew in 1979 what was going to happen. Okay, it's just nobody listened. Okay, so basically what he's saying is we've got to move quickly to carbon-free renewable energy. So let's talk about this. All right, so you're probably quite familiar with what we're talking about in terms of renewable energy sources. We're either talking about wind energy, which is harnessed using wind turbines, the modern version of windmills that you see down here. And the other would be solar panels, which gather light energy and convert it into electricity directly, if you will. So these are so-called renewable. They come from the sun, so this is effectively an inexhaustible source. They directly convert the energy source, the wind or the light, into electricity. The one disadvantage of wind and sun is that they're variable, okay? Of course, there's the light and dark cycle that limits solar energy, if you will, from solar panels. But the wind is variable as well. Some days it's more gusty than other days and so forth. So in conjunction with this type of energy, you need some way to store energy that then can be used when you're not getting that energy from your primary sources. All right? So we're going to talk about both of those things. And I want to get at this, actually, by going back and talking about fossil fuel and nuclear power, both of which I describe as old technology. Well, they're old because effectively the way we garner energy, either through fossil fuel power plants or nuclear power plants or whatever, is the same way that we've been garnering energy since the start of the Industrial Revolution, essentially using what people call heat engines. So in a heat engine, you've got to have a source of heat, and that heat then is used by the machine to do work. Okay, we'll see an example of this in a minute. But not all of that heat can be converted to work. A friend of mine taught, of course, at the University of Michigan on these sorts of topics and everything, and students used to get very upset. Why can't it be 100% efficient? Well, the physics say that you can only get a certain amount of energy out of a heat engine. You have to take some of that heat and move it to what we call a cold reservoir. Okay, you just move it to something that's colder. That's really what drives the whole process. So anyway, here's the picture. And this is something that we're talking about how we make electricity. And we're starting out with heat from combustion of coal, gas, oil, or from nuclear fission. All right, so we're going to take water, we're going to heat it up, convert it to steam. So that's your hot reservoir coming into your machine, making steam. You push the steam over to turn a turbine. That turbine then is connected to a generator, which, as that turbine turns, is going to convert that mechanical energy into electrical energy, and out it goes into the receiver, the home, the business, whatever, okay? So what happens here, though, as this goes through, it's got to go, some of it has got to go to the cold reservoir. Well, you can see why that's true here. So if this has to be converted back into liquid water, and so there has to be an external source here, that's the cold reservoir, which is always pulling out heat from this, converting it into liquid. Now we heat it up and push it out as steam and get the process going in a continuous fashion. Okay? I hope that makes sense to you. Well, all right, the features of this is, first of all, it's complicated. It also has a lot of upkeep associated with it. It's a non-renewable source. You've got to put in fuel all the time into it in one way or another. It uses lots of water. Why? Because that water has to be continually refreshed with cold water. So it also generates a lot of excess heat, something that has been really the bane of society since the start of the Industrial Revolution and so forth, is air pollution. So it generates an enormous amount of air pollution and the attendant health effects of that. If we were talking about nuclear fission, it'd be generating high-level radioactive waste. There are always the chances of major accidents, and it's expensive, right? So what happens when you make the transition to renewables? I mean, this looks pretty darn simple, and in a way it is, okay? All of what we saw over here, all of this disappears. And in wind turbines, we simply are replacing the turbine and generator in the previous power plant, fossil fuel power plant, by a wind turbine up here. In photovoltaic cells, in a sense, it's even simpler. All you have is a solar panel that's generating the electricity directly. Okay, this has an enormous amount of upside to it. These are simple machines with little upkeep. Direct generation of energy with a renewable energy source that doesn't have to be purchased over and over again. If you will, almost no water is used, almost no heat is generated, no air pollution, no high-level radioactive waste, no chance of major accident, and it's inexpensive. What can be the issue? We'll come back to that. Okay, so let's think about this in terms of comparative expense. And you can get the picture here. If you go back to 2010 at the cost of solar panels or solar voltaic, or offshore wind, onshore wind, and so forth, you see these have all fallen precipitously in the following decade. That's simply because of scale. I would say in part because of scale. All right, they now become commercially viable. But the other part of this is that scientists now can get grants, or at least they could get grants. You can get grants to study how to make more efficient solar panels. Okay, and that's going on. And so the efficiency of solar panels is getting better and better and better. Okay, that's just a function of the fact that we have really good scientists in this country and in other countries working on these problems, and a lot of people doing this. All right, so this is all important to recognize. This has become quite inexpensive relative to, this is the range for fossil fuel power, if you will. If you're thinking about standard nuclear plants, that's way up here. They're much more expensive than any of the rest of these alternatives. All right, so I just wanted to mention briefly, because you keep seeing people come back here, by golly, we're going to make nuclear part of this process if we have to, if we have to push it through the whole system, whether or not it makes sense or not. So these little small modular nuclear reactors, here's the cost for these per kilowatt hour. And now this is what the cost is, and the projected cost is for these renewable sources. Again, the renewable sources are they're much less expensive, and they get rid of the old technology and the problems of the old technology, which in the case of nuclear is heat, water, and really disposal of nuclear waste. Now let's talk about the other issue. The other issue is storage. Okay, there's a huge developing industry of thinking about hydrogen as a mobile storage source. Okay, so how do you make hydrogen? Well, you take water, you probably all did this in high school chemistry. You take water and carry out electrolysis of water, and you generate hydrogen in one of these test tubes and oxygen in the other one, if you will. Well, you can do this on a large scale, if you will, and pretty soon you've got a source of energy that then can be used by simply reacting again with oxygen to generate water and do work. Now, in this case, this is work through effectively a heat engine. But it's the way that we can smooth out the amount of energy that's available through the grid by having a storage form that is totally carbon-free, if you will. And furthermore, have it be mobile so they can be used in vehicles, which is a very important aspect to all of this that has to be solved. All right, so the other thing that comes into play with respect to hydrogen, and this we don't really know at the present time whether this is going to be as significant as it might be, but it turns out that the Earth is generating hydrogen, and maybe lots of it, just naturally. So it may be that there is virtually an unlimited source of hydrogen that we can tap that is not related to first having to get that solar energy convert it to electricity, and then use that to electrolyze water. So there are a lot of hopeful options. This country does not do much with respect to hydrogen, but I'll tell you what, other countries are. Germany has a functioning railroad that uses hydrogen as the source to run the passenger rail back and forth. All right, so let's go to the other side of this. The other side of the buildings and so forth that have to use this. And this is something that I think, we just have to come to grips with. We certainly are talking about and making inroads on converting the grid to a low carbon or no carbon grid, but we're doing virtually nothing about the receivers in comparison with where we are now. Okay? So we're thinking about buildings, we're thinking about transportation, we're thinking about manufacturing, agriculture, and so forth. All of these have to become fully compatible with electric sources of energy. Using electricity, using batteries that have stored energy from renewable electricity, using hydrogen, whatever. So buildings, that means all the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, everything has to use electricity. You can't use natural gas any longer, for example, for heating. Transportation, big issue. That's why there was such a push to start moving us to electric vehicles. In manufacturing and so forth, all these processes that are used in manufacturing to make things have to be converted from whatever mechanism they use now to ones that are fully compatible with electricity from the grid. All right, so as I say, think about it. How many times do you ever see anything in a news story about this side of the issue? We see it about how do we convert the grid, okay? But that's not going to help us very much if we're still using natural gas all the time. All right, so this all sounds great, but there is this problem that goes back to what we talked about last time. And that is the gross national product and the way we think about a successful economy. And that successful economy has got to have an ever-increasing gross national product. And the difficulty with this is, of course, we got to generate more and more energy to make all the goods and services for this growing economy and so forth. And yet, people are saying we just will not be able to make this transition because we can't do it fast enough. There's just too much to do to convert from whatever we're doing now to using a low carbon, no carbon energy source and so forth. But, I mean, essentially what we're saying is you want your cake and eat it too. You're going to keep growing the economy, yet you want to get to net zero carbon emissions. It just becomes harder and harder and harder to do. Okay, and that's why in the previous slide, I also talked about the fact that when we're considering all these things, we need to think about conserving energy and making sure everything is most energy efficient. Okay, electrifying mass transit. Okay, to use that as a way to lower total energy use. And then thinking about all of these processes becoming closed cycle processes that, again, are ways of lowering overall energy use. All right, so let's turn this into a tangible, very current, something you're probably all aware of now, and that is AI data centers. So there's a data center that's going to be going in Mount Pleasant. It's a Microsoft data center. It's reliably told to me personally, and I think this has also been in the news in one way or another, that that center is going to use as much electricity as the city of Madison. or as do all the homes in Milwaukee every day. Okay? Now that's just extra. That's not something we asked for in Wisconsin in order to net zero. That's just adding on to what we need to do to get to net zero. Well, it's not only one, this one, there are actually 4 in this region, all of which are within the We Energy area of the grid and so forth to service, that all want to start these data centers. So there's an enormous increase in the energy requirement, and we're not using much renewable right now. So this is just adding to the problem of how do we get to renewables. I just point this out to you to put this in a realistic context. Well, there is an author, a scientist, you may know him, his name is Václav Smil, and he writes books. And he writes books that probably only scientists read, or at least maybe everybody starts them, but after a chapter or 2, you can't take them anymore because they're all statistics and data and so forth. But anyway, he wrote a book just a few years ago, How the World Really Works. And at one point he said, because of the immensity of the transition, it will not be, in fact it cannot be, a sudden abandonment of fossil carbon. Not even its rapid demise, but rather a gradual decline. That's just his view of what's going to happen. Well, that's consigning the world to, catastrophe, literally. So if you go back and look at this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change graph here, where they have these various scenarios of what we have to do, you've got, okay, per year we're putting out a certain amount of carbon dioxide, and what we have to do is get that down to 0 and maybe get rid of some of the carbon dioxide. And you got to do that by 2050 to avoid the worst of climate change. That's this pathway. But now he's saying it's not going to be a sudden abandonment, not even a rapid demise, but rather a gradual decline. Well, the best we can do on this graph is this one, which is 2.7 degrees Celsius, or over 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which would just be a huge increase in average temperature, would make the midsection of the Earth literally uninhabitable. But I'm not even sure that he's thinking about that. It may be that this is going to go on for a while and then gradually come down, or maybe it'll go up a little more before it starts to come down, and we'll be in even a higher temperature realm. So I put in my one bit of humor into this talk, but this is my favorite cartoonist, Sidney Harris, science cartoonist. So the professor is looking at one of his students as going through a proof, and at one point the student had written, "Then a miracle occurs." And the professor says, "I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Okay. Well, if you like cartoons like this, you can Google Sidney Harris. You can find loads of them, which are very funny if you're a scientist. I don't know if they're funny to anybody else. Okay, so can we prove Václav Smil wrong? Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about a little bit. And so Milwaukee, city of Milwaukee, interacting with the county, produced its climate and equity plan. How many of you have heard of the climate and equity plan? Yeah, okay. A few of you have. Everybody should have heard of this. I just can't imagine why this is. I understand why, but I just can't believe under the current circumstances why this is so much under the radar, if you will. Okay, but you can either Google Milwaukee Climate and Equity Plan and find the plan, or here's the link to it. And basically, you know, the aspiration here is to do just what we had said the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said we need to do, and that is reduce emissions by 2030 to around 45% of what they are now, and finally get to net zero at 2050. And at the same time, they want to make this an equity plan. I think it was a good idea to help get more jobs for people who are unemployed and so forth in the city of Milwaukee. So there are so-called 10 ideas associated with this. And those 10 ideas are shown here, and you know, they fall into the categories of things that we've talked about before a lot. We need electric vehicles. We need to reduce vehicle miles. Okay, so we're not using as much energy. So this is mass transit, if you will. Residential energy efficiency, sure, but everything has to go to net zero ultimately. And then commercial building, they call this energy benchmarking, but it really means they have to go to net zero. And then there are some other aspects to this that I won't touch on at all, but the key thing is that this should generate lots of green jobs in the process. And all of this, of course, is dependent upon having this net zero electric grid. Okay, so thinking about the net zero electric grid, I'm going to focus in on We Energies just as an example. So this is their climate report from 2022. They have the 2023 one out. It's basically the same as 2022. I have not seen anything from 2024 yet. That should be coming out fairly soon, okay? So this is the way they describe what they've been doing. So they started out in 2005 with a certain, they call this greenhouse gas intensity, metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per megawatt hour. It's just a way of thinking about carbon dioxide in their mix. And by 2023, they were down to 52% of that level. 2025, this is at 42%. They project at 2030, this will be 20%, okay? So that looks pretty good. And by 2050, they want to be down to zero, all right? Now some observations about this. What's actually going on here? Well, in 2005, basically their power plants were coal and a little bit of nuclear. So up until 2023, what they were doing was converting coal to gas. What does that do for you? Well, it turns out that when you burn natural gas, you get twice as much heat per unit amount of carbon dioxide as you do with coal. So you should be able to get to pretty much half of this number with doing nothing about going to renewables. Okay, and that's sort of what has been happening. Then they project that between 2025 and 2030, they're going to take the last part of their coal power plants and convert those to solar. And then what they will have at this point is a combination of solar and gas-fired power plants. And then between 2030 and 2050, they will go all solar. Okay? So basically, they have kind of deferred doing anything about renewables until out in this region here. Okay. All right, now, in one hand, yes?
Now, regarding this, are you talking about the Oak Creek power plant that they're eventually is going to be closing?
Yeah. Yeah, the Oak Creek power, everything's going to be closed by 2032. Okay, that may be closed even earlier, I'm not sure. All right, just a couple comments about this. I mean, on the one hand, I think, you know, they've got a plan, okay? It's interesting, though, between 2025 and 2030, they're going to do $28 billion in investments, but only $9 billion of those in renewables. It's unclear exactly what goes into all of these investments if you look at that report, but it is bothersome to me that the majority, by far, of their investments are not in renewables during this time. We just can't wait around. Every bit of carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere is just there. All right, now the other side of this, though, that I think is very serious and probably may not have even been foreseen in 2022 or 2023, but it's here now, and that is that you've got all of these data centers, okay? And also, it's unclear that they've really thought about the fact that there are going to be a lot of buildings and vehicles that are converting from using fossil fuels to using electricity. That's not reflected at all in their plan. That's surely going to increase the demand for electricity. It's just trading one form of energy for another. Now, the issue about the data centers, though, is a really serious one, because in the last year, We Energies has gone to the Public Service Commission and asked to allow them to start up a whole series of new gas-fired power plants. Okay, it turns out to be a 28% increase in the amount of natural gas they're going to be using, which was not at all in their previous plans. I think probably this relates to these data centers to a great degree. But why are we doing this with natural gas? We should just do this with renewables. Yes?
Do you have a common idea of how big a solar farm even has power when you get?
I'm sorry, how?
How big of a solar farm would you need to power one of these new gas centers?
Well, gee, I probably can't give you the acreage exactly. My cousin actually has, I think it's like 100-acre piece of property down in Paris Township where they've just put a solar farm that's going to do 200 megawatts, which is a fairly large size, okay? So, you know, that's a scale of thinking about it. Okay?
You know, it's one thing that my solar panels power my house, but you're talking about a data center that size.
Well,
Is it reliable for them to build that into their plan?
well, it should be built into their plan. Absolutely, it should be built into their plan. Okay? I tell you a place where they could do it. The old Foxconn property. It's all lying fallow there, but I don't think Mount Pleasant wants a solar farm to go in there. They want something that's going to get them a lot more tax money than that. Okay, so those are the issues here that I think are quite serious, that sort of are not reflected in the last, at least public information that's available. Okay, now let's just go back to what I think is the most serious issue, and that's the residential. Okay, so just to sort of repeat this, every home, you know, has to reach net zero. That means everything: furnace, air conditioning, water heater, stove, lawnmower, snow blower, automobiles, everything has to go electric. Okay, now all of us actually are in a position to do that right now. And I think we should be doing it right now. Okay, for commercial buildings, according to the plan, every commercial building is going to have its own plan how to get to net zero, and the city will basically make sure it does. I mean, there'll be an agreement between the city and the commercial property. Okay? Now, there are a lot of upsides in all of this. people can, in new homes, use heat pumps instead of natural gas and so forth. We installed a heat pump about a year and a half ago. We use 1/3 the energy that we used before. Okay? It's expensive because electricity is expensive now. Once we get to all solar and wind, those costs should come way down. Okay, so this is sort of what I consider to be kind of our responsibility as individual citizens. We need to have a net zero building code, and we should support that sort of thing at the state level and so forth. We need to live in energy efficient, fully electrified dwellings. And I think we also need to support this equity-based training, okay, for basically electricians. We're going to need lots of electricians going forward. Okay, now, let me just give you an example about, this is what Václav Smil was talking about. In the city of Milwaukee, you've got 257,000 homes. A lot of them were built a long time ago. They're in poor condition. They need a lot of work, okay? But they need all the things we've been talking about, plus insulation, probably solar panels, lead abatement, removal of allergens, and so forth. And so you think about this and you say, well, that's impossible. But actually, over 25 years, that means 10,300 retrofits a year, or 43 completed every day. That doesn't seem impossible, okay? From a standpoint of just quantitatively doing the job. All right, there are issues of course, cost. I'm not going to go into detail about this, and of where this would be coming from, and are there enough skilled workers, and are there enough materials? These are all of the issues that we should have been thinking about for the last 25 years. We've let it go, and now we're in a crunch, and we have to think about it, and there may be some pain associated with it, but there's no other way to do it at present, because we have kept deferring maintenance, you might say. So this is the very last part of this. And I'm going to come back after saying all of this, which was kind of technical. I'm going to say these are problems that fundamentally have no technical solution. That doesn't mean that you don't use technology to solve them, but it means you could have all the technology in the world and they wouldn't get solved, which is what's happening at the present time. Okay? So this is a quote from Al Gore in his original book, An Inconvenient Truth. This is a moral moment, a crossroads. This is not ultimately about any scientific discussion or political dialogue. It's about who we are as human beings. This is a moral, ethical, and spiritual challenge. In other words, we have to have the will to do this. We actually have the means in this country. Western Europe has the means. First world countries surely have the means. They have the means to help the third world country make the transition. That's not the issue. The issue is, do we have the will to actually do this? So I just put it to us as Christians, do we, in the Christian community, have the intention and the will to get to net zero carbon emissions quickly and help the world achieve that? So, I always come back to this quote from E.O. Wilson. You may know E.O. Wilson. Some people talk about him as the father of biodiversity, the concern for biodiversity and so forth. He wrote a book called The Creation, an appeal to save life on Earth. And he's talking to a pastor. He says, "We have not met, yet I feel I know you well enough to call you friend. Pastor, we need your help. The creation, living nature is in deep trouble. You may well ask at this point, why me? because, now this is interesting, maybe you don't think so much in this way now, because religion and science are the two most powerful forces in the world today. I'm puzzled that so many religious leaders who spiritually represent a large majority of people around the world have hesitated to make protection of the creation an important part of their magisterium. Do they believe that human-centered ethics and preparation for the afterlife are the only things that matter? Okay, and as I said last week, I'm a Lutheran, and that seems like a pretty good statement of where our focus is in the Lutheran Church. So I'll just say that personally, I think going back to where we started in this whole thing about the creed and how it has so little to say about God the Father, creator of heaven and earth, that actually there's a lot to be said that can be biblically based. And I'm just going to give you something that speaks to me as a conclusion here. Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He, Jesus, said to him, what is written in the law? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. You have answered right, do this and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? The earth. That is an ecological statement. That is a statement of how we understand the basis of life on this planet. Okay? And so I leave you with that thought, and hope that we all do what we can to prevent what looks like a runaway catastrophe coming down the tracks. I hate to put it in those terms, but that's where we are. Now, I do want to say one other thing. I always put this at the end because I think it's just an absolutely wonderful picture. It's basically, to me, as strong an argument for what we're doing as you can imagine here. Here's John Kerry signing the Paris Climate Agreement with his granddaughter on his lap. Love your children, love your grandchildren, and love the earth. Okay? Now, I brought along something, if any of you are interested. It's in the League of Women Voters. I'm actually in the League of Women Voters. So they have a climate action group. If any of you are interested, you don't have to join the League of Women Voters, but if any of you are interested, you could just sign here, and my wife will get in touch with you. Okay? So thank you very much.
Before we take questions, I just want to be sure to say thanks to Shell, thanks to the Green Team for encouraging presentation on this topic. What an honor it is for us to have a scientist who can explain things clearly in a compelling way, an authentic way. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You. Who has the first question? Richard.
Not quite sure how to explain this, but we looked at putting solar panels on our house to help with this. But with We Energies, it's very economically not in our favor. It favors them. And so another piece of all this that goes into it, I think, is the political and economic parts. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I can just tell you what we did. We have solar panels on our garage, okay? And I'm not exactly sure what the situation is now in the new administration with rebates and things like this through the Inflation Reduction Act, but we put solar panels on that handle a lot of our electricity. can't say, now that we have a heat pump, they don't handle everything, but we used Arch Electric, and they did a really nice job. Were very easy to work with, and it cost us about $14,000. Okay, I mean, I just. Oh, let's put it that way, sure. If you generate any electricity, they give you Zippo. Okay, that's true. You, in a way, I mean, we did it. I mean, who needs to do it? You've got, you're getting your electricity, you're doing this and doing that. I mean, you're paying your monthly bill. We did it because of what I'm talking to you about. It costs some money, but honestly, for much of the year, we don't pay anything. We don't use any, now that we have a heat pump, we don't use any natural gas to speak of. So I find it you know, satisfying that at least we're trying to do something on a personal level, okay? Yeah?
It's maybe practical, but people tend to replace their appliances as they wear out, furnaces, air conditioners, and water heaters. To get a heat pump, does that replace it all at once, or can it just replace one of the things that breaks, or? I don't.
Yeah, it replaces everything. I mean, it does your air conditioning if you do
All at
that.
once.
It does, yeah, it does your heating and air conditioning. Yeah, yeah.
Who has a Michelle?
This is not a question, but it's a comment. When I was at the University of Michigan, I used to go to international seminars. And I found, in the ones in Canada, this is in the 1970s, they already had codes and requirements for energy efficiency in their buildings. And it's only come, I mean, that's 1977, 78, 79. They already had it in the works. I could not understand why the US did not have those codes built in. And as David was saying, in that 1978 Carter report, I mean, there was a whole issue with Scientific American all about global warming and, you know, the basis behind it, and it was the National Academy of Engineering and National Academy of Sciences. They all were saying, hey, folks, take a look at this. And I know when I retired from, after Wisconsin Electric sold us to Florida Power and Light or NextEra Energy, at Point Beach, there were 1,800 acres. Now, about 1,200 of those acres have been turned into a solar farm, and the area around the Point Beach site that's still owned by WE, they've also turned into solar farms. So there's a lot being done, but nobody thought about these data centers.
Let me just say one thing about what Chell was saying. You can do graphs of, what would those graphs be? Okay, energy use per individual as a function of GDP. And, you know, you kind of have a straight line like this or something for a while, and then you see these points that are off the line and so forth. And the United States uses, per person, twice as much energy as people in Western Europe. Now, people in Western Europe have standards of living that are easily as good as ours. And some people would say better. Yet they use half the amount. Well, I mean, there are reasons for that. They have taken seriously these issues for a long time.
You talked about Milwaukee County and what Milwaukee County's plan is. but you didn't reference the rest of the state and even counties around Milwaukee County. And I'm not reading a whole lot in the Milwaukee Journal about how the rest of the state and the state legislature is approaching the issues that you discussed today.
Yeah, I guess
So-
I should have clarified a little bit. The city of Milwaukee basically has adopted this plan. The county, probably within the last 2 or 3 months, the county board has agreed to work with the city. So, I mean, it isn't quite the same thing as adopting the plan, but they're going to work together. The interesting point is that the county has all these municipalities. The League of Women Voters, through this group that I just mentioned to you, did a survey. And, you know, I think there are like 18 municipalities. And only a few of those actually are sort of actively thinking about this. So Whitefish Bay is not. Fox Point is not. I think there are plans, like Madison has a plan. I'm not sure about other smaller places. I think there is nothing. Governor Evers has put forward kind of a general climate plan, but the legislature, as long as the current distribution between Republicans and Democrats exists, I don't think you're going to see anything happen at the legislative level. I'm sure Evers would like it, but I don't think you'll see that.
Before we adjourn, can we just put our heads down for a minute and have a moment of silence and prayer for how we can move forward? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, enjoyed it. I know, I think it's,
Yes.
Still live in the house and the electric bill, if it wouldn't have gone out and one of the monthly bills would get saying, this is what we're doing.
I guess we need to start asking. Because if customers ask,
Yeah,
they
and I-
tend to listen.
Yeah, and I broached the question at St. John's, why don't we put solar panels on the top of the house and down the sides of the buildings?
Or in the windows.
They have solar panels. They have now solar films. And Honda has come out with a car engine that has on hydrogen. The big thing is, how do you store the hydrogen? And I guess they could, there's a metal alloy or something you can that's really spongy. Apply a small charge from your battery to release the hydrogen from the car. So that
On the
would,
top.